Lots of what I'll share with you today is actually linking back to things that we've talked about and thought about before, but really started to frame it in terms of how do we get the results from the plusness of thinking about learning. And of course, when we're talking about that, we're really talking about metacognition. If you think about metacognition, there's lots of ways of thinking about it. There's some outdated ways of thinking about it, I think, and some more kind of cutting-edge ways of thinking about it. This article in The Conversation, you might know The Conversation, it's a newspaper, an online newspaper written by academics. This article in The Conversation last week was talking about, it says, here's how to think about the risk of rare events. And so it talks about how poor we are at dealing with rare events. And it goes on to talk about, and I'm not expecting you to read the text, it's just that highlighted bit there, that metacognitive awareness. It's hard to change your thinking, to intentionally and purposefully change your thinking if you're not aware of your thinking. The point that's made in this article is that we don't deal very well, as human beings, we don't deal very well with assessing the risk associated with rare events. We overestimate the risk associated with rare events and underestimate the risk associated with everyday events. And so with rare events, what we've talked about here is that we are built so that that rare event, we remember that. It has a strong impact on us and we remember that. And we don't give as much weight to all those times that you don't hear about, all those people going into the water and not being attacked by a shark, all those times that you've been in the water and not being attacked by a shark. And so we're very poor at getting that balance of weight right. You can only change your thinking when you've got this metacognitive awareness, when you're aware of your thinking and you're aware of alternative ways of thinking. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. So when we're talking about metacognition, if I go back to, I showed you this clip last time, Stuart Firestein talking about the pursuit of ignorance and how important it is to think about what you don't know. I'm not going to play this whole clip again. I'm just going to play less than a minute out of it with Firestein talking about what scientists do and how scientists think.
When I go to a meeting, after the meeting day is over and we collect in the bar over a couple of beers with my colleagues, we never talk about what we know. We talk about what we don't know. We talk about what still has to get done, what's so critical to get done in the lab.
So last time we talked about Firestein talking about what we don't know, and that importance we see in the critical and creative thinking research around student-student interaction being so important for developing that kind of thinking. But the bit that I want to pick out today is where he talks about, they talk in the bar, in the pub, they talk about what they're going to do in the lab. And when we've got our STEM works going in DCD and we're building all these labs in schools, I want to suggest that we're not building enough bars in schools. We're not building enough pubs in schools. Metaphorical bars, obviously. And that, of course, the metaphor being that you have the bar where you talk about what you don't know, where you talk about what you're going to do, where you talk about the ways you've got of thinking about this thing, and then you go into the lab, and when you're in the lab, you do the sciencey stuff, you do your experiments and that kind of thing, and you draw your graphs, and you do all that stuff. And then what you do with your results is, you go back into the bar, and you go, so what does this mean? What are we going to do with this? I've got no idea. And you talk about what you don't know again, and the questions that are raised, and all of those things. And of course, it's the same in every learning area. Every learning area has got its metaphorical lab, where you do the thing, you write the essay, you do the thing, you do the inquiry, the piece of work, you produce the thing, whatever it is, the artifact that you're producing is. But our kids just going through the motions if that's all they've got. Going back to the bar and talking about what they don't know, being aware of their thinking, the possible ways of doing this thing, whatever the production of the artifact is. There's these two kind of interrelated, and you can go backwards and forth between the two. But that linear doing of the subject is located in the lab, and the thinking really is located in the bar. And you might remember this article that I showed you last time in connection with Dweck's work, and what it was talking about was how kids with a growth mindset think differently from kids with a fixed mindset. And I showed you this image, and as you remember, looks good, but it's got no information in it at all. And this was the image that actually has got all the information in it. And the point being from this, this chart, that what you can see in red are the kids with a fixed mindset, in blue, the response to the kids with a growth mindset. And what we're seeing in this chart is the activity in a particular, or the change in activity in a particular area of the brain when kids get something right. So that's the dotted line at the top, the error trials, the correct trials rather, the dotted line at the top. And you can see that the fixed mindset kids and the growth mindset kids in red and blue are pretty much the same. Where we see a difference is in the incorrect trials, the error trials, where kids are getting things wrong. And you can see that in red, the amount of activity from the 0 line, so that's an increase actually going down. There's an increase in activity from the 0 line for the fixed mindset kids, but there's even more of an increase in activity for the growth mindset kids. The growth mindset kids are thinking about getting things wrong with greater activity than the fixed mindset kids. And the researchers even said in this paper, when you take these results with past findings, what you see is that one of the reasons why growth mindset kids get this increased likelihood from learning from mistakes is if they've got this online error awareness. They're thinking about getting things wrong, thinking about what it means to get things wrong. It's a way of them thinking about their learning, thinking about their performance. They're more metacognitive, I'm going to suggest, than the growth mindset kids. And of course, what they're doing more of is that those executive functions that we've talked lots about before, the kids having the opportunity to stop and think about getting things wrong. Because when they've not got that opportunity to stop and think, they're just rushing through. They're doing a thing, getting it right, they're doing a thing, they're getting it wrong, they're doing the next thing, they're doing the next thing, and they're just rushing through, and they're not getting that opportunity necessarily to be metacognitive. So they need that opportunity to stop and think and reflect on what they've been doing. There's lots of resources around metacognition, and it's interesting to see how the tone of the conversation about metacognition has changed over the last few years. I know you're going to see a little bit more of this I think later on today, but I just wanted to play you this short clip from the Smithsonian Institute.
You see, studies have shown that giving students practice with metacognitive strategies can improve how well they transfer knowledge to new contexts and how long it sticks around in their noggins.
Metacognition is a path to understanding. I thought metacognition was merely thinking about your thinking. Pure navel-gazing.
Poppycock. That way of thinking is antiquated.
Says the guy who just exclaimed poppycock.
Recent research has demonstrated that effective learning involves planning and goal setting, continual monitoring of one's progress by identifying what you know and working on what you don't know, and then adapting as necessary, all of which are part of metacognition.
So there's a longer clip online, but I just wanted to pick that little bit out because it's shifting us from thinking about metacognition being thinking about your thinking to thinking about metacognition being an awareness of your learning, taking control of your learning. It's interesting that we call these metacognitive strategies. There's a funny thing going on, isn't there? Because these are cognitive strategies. I've got a problem, a task, a scenario, a thing at hand that I want to, that's challenging that I want to deal with. And so we've been doing goal setting, of course, with kids in the early years all the way through to senior secondary for many years. But this point about the continual monitoring, going back to that paper about the brain activity when kids are getting things wrong. The point about identifying, being clear about what you do know, and also, like with Firestein, talking about what you don't know. Identify what we don't know, and then how we're going to find it out. We're going to think about it in this way, and that's not working out for us, so we're going to pivot and adapt and think about it in a different way. These are cognitive strategies, ways of thinking. The metacognitive bit is choosing to use these strategies. It's thinking about your learning and going, this isn't working out for me. Okay, now, what am I going to do? What could I do? I could identify what I know, a cognitive strategy. I could identify what I don't know. The metacognitive bit is the choosing. It's the being above all of these things and making selections because of the way that we're thinking. And so knowing these strategies, even things like a mnemonic, so here's a thing, a list of things I've got to remember. What could I do? A cognitive strategy is to come up with a mnemonic so that I've got the letters and I can go through and that'll give me a hint. So it's okay to have those strategies, but they're not very useful unless you've got the metacognitive thinking above it. This is going to be hard to remember. How might I go about remembering this? And the strategy might be to come up with a mnemonic. Of course, it also creates a role, and some research from the UK about the use of classroom SSOs also creates opportunities for SSOs. One of the problems that they've got in the UK, of course, that they've seen with SSOs, is that the SSOs have been rescuing kids. They've been doing the relationship rescue stuff and been rushing in and rescuing kids and giving them the answers when they've been struggling. Giving SSOs a framework to help kids to be more metacognitive. You know, when the kids are struggling, ask them to identify what they know. What do you know? What don't you know? How are you thinking about that thing? How else could you think about it? For the SSOs to be bringing some of that metacognition to the kids. And I'll go back to the toolkits, those big meta-analyses from the Education Endowment Foundation. We've got the Early Years Toolkit and the Schooling Toolkit. Some of you might have seen the Australian versions being produced from the Evidence for Learning organisation. It's exactly the same data from all around the world. The point that I want to make, I know you can't read these, the point that I want to make is that at the top of the list, on the schooling list, in terms of all the things that we could do that there's this meta-analysis about, what are the things that have the most impact? What are the things at the top of the list in terms of impact? Feedback and metacognition. In fact, what we can see there is that feedback and metacognition, you might not be able to see actually, but feedback and metacognition both add an extra 8 months of progress within 12 months of schooling. So that's the way that their effect size is different from the way John Hattie calculates his effect size, so they express it in a different way. But within 12 months, if you're not doing, focusing on metacognition and self-regulation, compared to when you are focusing on metacognition and self-regulation, when you introduce that, you get an extra 8 months worth of progress out of the kids over a 12-month period. The same with quality feedback. But in fact, when you look at those icons which look like little black squares and in fact little padlocks, are showing us that in fact the evidence around metacognition and self-regulation is more locked in. There's more padlocks, there's more evidence for metacognition and self-regulation to have an impact on results and achievement than even feedback. In the early years, we see the same thing. At the top of the list is self-regulation strategies. So again, stopping, thinking, getting hold of your thinking, being aware of your thinking. If we unpick those on the toolkit, if you're aware of it, the online toolkit, if you click on it, there's a whole bunch of text. And again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. But in the early years, let me pick out a couple of points. It talks about how the things that people do that support kids' self-regulation is this articulating their plans, articulating the way that they're going to do something, their learning strategies, and then coming back and reviewing what they have done. Stuff that you've been doing for years anyway. But a focus on this, not just as an activity. There's a danger, isn't there, that we say, okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this thing. The point isn't to just do the thing. It's to get the kids thinking in this way. You can insist that all the staff do this and do it in this way. And of course, we kill it when we do that because we're not necessarily actually getting the action, the principle enacted that we're looking for. It goes on to talk about how this self-regulation, this with executive functions, this stop and think, getting hold of your thinking, we see that there's a consistency because we can see getting improvement in reading, improvement in mathematics, improvement in problem solving. And what we also see, importantly, is that while it is a high impact strategy, we get a lot of boost in achievement across the board when we introduce this kind of thinking into our teaching. What we're seeing is it's a high equity strategy as well. Everybody improves, but the low performing, low SES kids tend to improve even more. It's an equity leveler as a strategy. And the last point I just want to pick out from here is, that thinking about, okay, so let's do plan, do, review approach. So we're going to do a building activity. They're drawing on one particular example. Okay, so stop. How are you going to do it? In the bar, in the pub. How might we do it? What we're going to do? Now we go into the lab, build the thing. Now go back into the bar. How was that? What were your successes? Were your failures? How would you do things differently? Again, things that I know that you've been doing anyway. If we go to the schooling meta-analysis, again, let's just pick out a couple of points. High impact, 8 months additional progress, I've already talked about that. And again, what we see is schooling, high equity, right across the board. Primary schools, high equity, so it has a bigger impact for low achieving students. Again, we come back to the point about collaborative. These strategies are more successful, more effective when we use them with collaborative groups, getting the kids talking to each other, making their thinking explicit. Being in the pub, the metaphorical pub, being in the bar, making their thinking explicit, talking to each other before rushing in and doing the thing, whatever the thing is. It actually says in the meta-analysis, there is no simple method or trick for this. You make it into a program, you kill it. Because you get lots of actions and you don't necessarily get the thinking coming through for the kids. It goes on to talk about how there's a consistency in the research. When you do meta-analysis, when you look at the meta-analysis and you see that when you get metacognition and self-regulation going in your classrooms, you tend to get an impact, and it doesn't matter what the learning area. And so we see this suggestion that it's widely applicable right across aspects of schooling. The sorts of things that people have done, well, the research that the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, have been doing is looking at growth mindsets, that philosophy for children, which includes the community of inquiry that I know some of you have been doing in your schools, a science program called Thinking, Doing, Talking Science, and they're getting this boost for over 12 months. The kids are developing not just 12 months worth, but an extra 2 or 5 months. Lots of different learning areas, all focusing on metacognition one way or another. Those of you that have seen the Most Likely to Succeed documentary, when we think about philosophy for children, the community of inquiry, we might put in there things like the Socratic seminars that are in that documentary as well. So when we're talking about metacognition, we're talking about kids taking control of their thinking, being aware of their learning so that they can choose alternatives. Not being passive, we've talked about that for a while, but being able to take control of their thinking and think in different ways, choose to think in different ways. And of course that's connected to those executive functions that we've been talking about for a while, that impulse inhibition, recognizing that you're having an emotional response and saying, okay, so I'll let that pass over me. You know, when I do PD, when I work with partnerships and we do PD together, we do a professional learning day, where you get the feedback and everybody hands the feedback sheets in and then you have a look at them through the day, at the end of the day. I always have to do them twice because I recognize I'm metacognitive about the first time I do it emotionally. I go through and every time anybody said a nice thing, I think, oh, that's great. And any time anybody says something that's critical, I think, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. and then I recognize I've got to do it again. I've got to go through, and then all the ones that have said something nice, I can ignore them because I'm thinking now, I'm not just having an emotional response. I'm going to ignore those, and the ones I'm going to pick out were the ones that are discounted emotionally because I didn't want to deal with it. So I'll stop and think, what is this person saying? How could I have done things differently? I've got to do it twice because I've got to inhibit the impulse to have an emotional response when I go through it a second time. So these stop and think skills become important, of course, and they become important even in things like NAPLAN prep. There's many ways of doing NAPLAN prep. 2 ways. One of the ways is to do more maths, get the kids to practice doing more maths. And another way is a metacognitive way, to get the kids to recognize that some of these questions, especially in numeracy or some of the writing questions, you're not supposed to be able to just do them. You're supposed to look at them and go, how am I supposed to do that? And then have a go anyway. But when you look at it and go, how am I supposed to do that? Recognize that you might still have something to offer that question. Don't not do it just because you've had that feeling. Inhibit that impulse. Another way of doing a metacognitive NAPLAN prep is around working memory. Again, lots of those writing questions in particular and the numeracy questions, there's just too much information to hold in your head. I can't do some of those questions without writing stuff down. So don't try and hold it all in your head. Don't get overwhelmed by it all and then think, I just can't do this. If there's too much information in your head and you feel yourself getting overwhelmed, write it down, get it out of your head on the paper. Draw a picture, draw a diagram, draw a scheme of some case. Don't try and hold it all in your head, because none of us have the working memory capacity to do it. We want to be able to do the maths. But without the metacognition and the self-regulation and the executive function, what we see is you can know a lot of maths and still not be able to do the questions, especially those problem-solving questions. This is a favorite book of mine. One of the reasons it's now a favorite, because it's got my name in it, because I was one of the people that crowdfunded this book. It's an early years maths book, maths textbook. I never talk about maths textbook, because it's not really a textbook, it's a problem-solving strategies book. So it's an early years problem-solving strategies book. One of the techniques, so it talks about lots of different techniques, one of the techniques is this avoid hard work technique. And the example that it gives, now don't forget this is for the early years, the example that it gives is, here's an L-shaped piece. We can cut it into 2 identical pieces, as you can see there, 3 identical pieces or 4 identical pieces. And the question is, how would you chop the L-shaped piece into 300 identical pieces? So, let's think about the strategy that it suggests. First on the list, react emotionally to the problem. When have you ever seen a maths textbook that says that? This is why I crowdfunded it. React emotionally to the problem. There is no way I am drawing 300 pieces. I'm not doing it. It's too hard. Have your emotional reaction. Then inhibit that impulse and think about what you are going to do, and then that's the rest of the techniques. Every technique in the book starts with have an emotional response to the problem. So let's come back to Firestein's bar and lab. That thinking about how are we going to get our kids thinking, talking about what they don't know, talking about ways of thinking. Of course, we've been talking about that quite a lot. You know, how do we help our learners talk about what they don't know? And one of the ways that we've talked about it is the idea of Googleable and non-Googleable questions. And so, as an example, let me show you a piece of text. We could read this text. I might just give you a moment to have a read of the familiar text. All right, so let's think about some Googleable and non-Googleable questions. I could ask some questions to get information out of the text about, you know, the time of year or what Piglet was wearing or just actual information from the text. I could ask Googleable questions, and I could ask some non-Googleable questions. And of course, in our discussions so far, we've been talking about the importance of non-Googleable questions, where students have to bring their judgment. They're not multi-structural. It's not about here's a bit of information that I've got and here's another bit of information and here's another bit of information. We're asking the students to put that together with some reasoning and make it some kind of judgment along the way. But of course, the really important bit, the real difference between Googleable and non-Googleable questions is actually about how you might answer them. And understanding the nature of the question and thinking about how might I answer that question? How might I go about answering a Googleable question? And how might I go about answering a non-Googleable question? This is the metacognitive layer. Asking yourself the question, thinking about your own learning, thinking about your own thinking processes, and saying, okay, so how might I go about this? When we give kids non-Googleable questions, what we're helping them to develop is the ability to bring together their thinking, their judgment, all of those things. When we get kids to think metacognitively, what we're allowing them to do, what we're developing within them is the strategies to take the things that we've taught them and make them really work for them. Because they can think about how they might answer this question rather than just thinking about answering the question. When we ask the non-Googleable question, then these sorts of strategies come into play. When we ask the Googleable question, there kind of aren't any metacognitive strategies. There's information gathering strategies, but there's not really many metacognitive strategies. The metacognition really starts to kick in when things are tricky, when we've been asked those non-Googleable questions, when we have to bring our judgment, when we're in the last quarter of the NAPLAN numeracy test. Remember this? Those questions about would you rather, and we use that would you rather carry 20 towels or 80 bars of soap as an example. Of course, I'm not going to go through that again, but I do want to remind you of the questions that we asked when we talked about that, the way in which you might answer those would you rather questions. How might your learning area help you to decide whether you'd rather carry 20 towels or 80 bars of soap? What might you need to find out? How would you find that thing out? Is there another way? Now, what have you got from your learning area and now come up with an answer? And how else could you use your reasoning, your maths reasoning or your learning area reasoning? How else could you use this in your life? Almost all of these questions, apart from what's the answer, all of these questions are metacognitive questions. They're all asking the kids about how are you going to think about this thing, rather than asking them questions about the specific process or the specific content. These are all questions about how are you going to think about this. These are all questions supporting and promoting and demanding of the kids that they use their cognition to drive their thinking. Where else can you see this? Well, there's a lot of documents around. I was looking at a number of documents and just picking out some of the metacognitive language, or language that could be interpreted as being metacognitive. I found this document and I was looking through it. You might start to recognize it as I go through. We're asking students to make sense of their learning by talking it through with others, backing up with their ideas with opinions and examples. So a lot of staying in the bar rather than rushing into the lab and just doing stuff. Some self-assessment in there, some thinking about my thinking, my performance, how it could be different, an awareness of what they know, want to know, or what they need to know. Almost exactly what I've just been talking about. What is this document? TEFL framework. Looped all the way back around to the TEFL framework. In South Australia, we've been talking about this for a long time. We might not have put that emphasis on the metacognitive aspects of it, but metacognition is all the way through the TEFL framework. And all the supporting documents, the TEFL guide, all those things have just got this language all the way through it. So this is just a quick kind of introduction, summary, linking back to some of the thinking that we've done before. But what we're seeing more and more, I'm actually involved with the Education Endowment Foundation now, writing a practice guide for educators in the UK and Australia and around the world about the use of metacognition in education. But we're already doing it. The reason why the Education Endowment Foundation came to South Australia and said, we're interested in what you're doing there, was because they've seen the power of metacognition through their research, and they've also seen South Australians doing it, putting it into practice. I'm not talking about metacognition as something that we've not been doing. We've been doing it, we've been developing it, we just might not have thought about it in these terms. I'm going to end now, but what I'm going to invite you to do is to have a think about these questions. And it's that question about the high equity as well as high impact strategy, the high equity, high impact nature of metacognitive strategies. Why do you think they are so high impact? And why do you think they have such a high equity characteristic to them? How did they create this equity leveling?